nerds. This is Nerdy by Nature. I'm one of your hosts, Agent Smith, aka Tyler.
And I'm Charlie, aka Captain Rogers.
And so we're going to go ahead and do a recap of the Shining film as well as Doctor Sleep. So Doctor Sleep just released in theaters here recently in 2019. Of course, The Shining came out back in 1980, so there's quite a time gap between both of these films. But both, in their own right, are solid. Of course, one being a visionary Kubrick cult classic, and the other one being a very well done sequel by Flanagan. And both of them are very enjoyable to watch. I think, to be honest, Doctor Sleep has a little bit more of a creepy factor than the 1980 version of The Shining, although there's still plenty of scary things about the original and the tone and the score that was initially set in The Shining, the 1980 movie. Definitely will, if nothing else, stress you out.
Definitely. I really enjoyed Doctor Sleep. I almost want to say more so than The Shining. And I realized once I found out that Mike Flanagan was also involved in Haunting at Hill House, the Netflix show. That show got such a great reception and everybody loved it, so it made sense to me as to why Doctor Sleep was such a good movie.
And he does a great job. He knows how to ramp up that fear factor. There's plenty of jump scares in Doctor Sleep. The imagery, definitely harkens back and has a few callbacks for sure to The Shining as well. So it's just overall a well-done movie. It's not one that's going to break the box office budget by any means. But if you're a fan of The Shining, then you'll absolutely love Doctor Sleep. And it's one that, like I said, we both thoroughly enjoyed. And, of course, The Shining is a classic in its own right. Maybe not for everybody, but still do it justice and do this review right. We wanted to go over The Shining first and then dive into Doctor Sleep. And so before we get into Doctor Sleep, let's go ahead and talk about The Shining. It's one of those that's just a classic 80s horror film, and it gets the Stanley Kubrick full effect touch.
Definitely.
You can tell right away just the visuals in the movie and the cinematography is second to none. Of course, Kubrick, the same director that's behind A Space Odyssey, 2001, A Space Odyssey, I should say, Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, the list goes on and on. So if you've seen his films, you kind of have an idea of what you're getting into with The Shining. And of course, before we go into both of these films, as we always let you know, spoiler alert, we are about to fully go into both The Shining and Doctor Sleep. So if you've seen both the movies, no worries, continue to listen. If you haven't and you want to watch The Shining first, which we highly recommend you do before you go in to watch Doctor Sleep, just fast forward, listen to another episode. We've got a couple of them out there available.
And this one will be available as soon as you're done seeing the movies. But I'm just going to be truthful here. I have a hard time with Kubrick's style and his films, honestly. I've seen a lot of them just because everybody said how wonderful they are. And it's just such an interesting and different style and just doesn't seem real world to me, just how people act in it and everything in like his movies. And so I really enjoyed Doctor Sleep a lot more than I enjoyed The Shining.
I think that's understandable. And Kubrick is certainly, and his list of work is not necessarily for everyone, and I do think that some of his films can be more metaphorically based in some senses. And also, he is somebody that's on record as being an envelope pusher. He's going to bend genres and really started some staples for some other genres in their own right, especially the horror and sci-fi fields. So it's, again, to each their own, of course. But in this particular film, The Shining by Kubrick, like I said, the cinematography is just top-notch, 5 out of 5. Nerdy by nature on the scale there, if we had to do one for cinematography. The scenes are just beautifully shot, and it really hypes up that tension and makes you feel like you're actually in the hotel yourself with Nicholson and the family. So, of course, the opening shot right away is a creepy pan-in to a Colorado beautiful scenery lake. We go up to a winding road that goes up to what will essentially be our main setting for this film, the Overlook Hotel. And, of course, we get introduced right away to Jack Nicholson's character, Jack Torrance. He's got an interview to be the caretaker at this particular hotel. Of course, it is open from May until October, their busy season when it's warm, and then from essentially late October all the way until about late April, that's when it slows down for about 5 months. Right. And so they need a caretaker to literally make sure that everything's maintained and that the hotel is ready to go when they open back up in May. Seems like a simple job, right? And of course, during the interview process, he lets him know, it behooved me to not tell you that there's a little bit of history behind this hotel, some of it not so happy. And he mentions a Mr. Grady and that he was also a caretaker back in the 70s. And so the movie itself was released in 1980 and also takes place in 1980. And so Mr. Grady back in the 70s was a caretaker, seemed much like Jack Torrance's character early on in the film, like a nice, well-to-do guy, just looking for good work during the winter. But unfortunately, due to the isolation and confinement of that particular hotel, it's perched atop high in the Rocky Mountains. It's hard to get to in the winter. Most of the roads become impassable. You can't really drive on them, and so you're pretty well stuck in this hotel. He goes crazy, murders his family with an axe. It's a pretty brutal story, and would be enough for me personally to be like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't. I probably wouldn't have, but I will say that even at the beginning with Jack Torrance, you already know that there's something a little, not necessarily off about him, but he's had history with alcohol and not being exactly great to his wife and kid. So you already know that there's something bad in the background of this character before they even get to the hotel.
There's definitely some underlying things at play, because as they're doing the interview, we get a good back and forth between Shelley Duvall, who plays Wendy Torrance, his wife, and then Danny Lloyd, who plays Danny Torrance, which, a little creepy that the kid's name is actually Danny. I was not expecting that when we were doing the research, so right. I'm sure that kid probably had some interesting nightmares and callbacks to the filming of this particular movie, but he does a great job, Danny Lloyd, in this as a child actor. I mean, plays it up to the fullest, had to deal with a split personality throughout this film, so I mean, every character really, I think, was perfectly picked for this movie, and that's why it works so well. And again, that's just a testament to the genius of Stanley Kubrick. He knew who he was working with and knew exactly what he wanted for each scene and how he wanted it to play out.
Right.
Of course, it's important for us to mention that The Shining is an adaptation of the Stephen King novel with the same name. And so, in this back and forth between mother-son combo, we see that they have a child psychiatrist come visit because he has an episode in the bathroom with his imaginary friend, if you will. Tony passes out. Of course, she asks, when did Tony start appearing? And the mother explains that in one drunken rage, Jack Torrance came home, found his paperwork, he's a writer, all over the floor. He meant to just pull Danny up by his arm and scold him and say, hey, don't do this. But of course he was drunk and wound up dislocating his shoulder.
Right.
And so of course the psychiatrist thought this sounded a little off or odd. Shelley Duvall's character is kind of like, yeah, it just happens.
I will say that I found it very odd, that whole scene, because if you think about it in today's terms, as soon as that came to light, that kid probably would have been taken out of that home, like right then, or else the wife would have been gone from the husband or something. So it felt really odd watching it now, and that psychiatrist just kind of letting it go.
Right, it was odd and a little bit off-putting as well, because you did think about it in today's reference, and you had to almost think, well, I suppose you could make the argument that it was a different time.
Right.
And that those things, it happens all over the place all the time, but especially in this particular scene, it makes you wonder, why wouldn't the psychiatrist comment on that or make a report? But of course, if that was the case, we wouldn't have the rest of the film. But just another way to show you that, to your point, Charlie, Jack Torrance is not what you would call a poster boy for an ideal father figure.
Definitely.
In this film. I don't think he even wants to be really a part of the family dynamic.
It's weird just watching it, because especially once he gets the job and him and his wife and his son are on the way to the hotel, just that car trip, their conversation and the way they act, and
it's very uneasy.
It's uneasy and just weird.
And at one point, of course, they're driving through the Rocky Mountains, and Shelley Duvall's character Wendy mentions, hey, wasn't this roughly about the area where the Donner Party got snowbound, which is a little bit random to bring up, but it's car conversation. She's trying to lighten the mood, I guess, a little bit by bringing up cannibalism.
Yeah, how that works, I'm not sure, but
maybe not the best way. But again, some people get nervous in those situations, and she thinks, I'll just make conversation with my husband.
Right.
And of course, with Danny in the back seat, he says, well, yeah, I've heard about the Donners. And of course, then Jack goes into exactly what happened. And then you find out that Danny actually is already well aware of what cannibalism is because he watched it on television.
Right.
So it's just a creepy family from the get-go with all kinds of interesting dynamics. And so they arrive at the hotel, and they're being shown around, and we get explained by the hotel manager that it's been there for a long time, since 1907. There was a period where it was actually built on a Indian burial ground and constructed at that time. During the construction, of course it was finished, I should say, and opened in 1907, but during the construction, they had to battle off some of the Indians that previously owned the land, and so you get a sense right away that there's just some bad blood, bad voodoo in this spot. So it's not off. They didn't build it on a good foundation to start with. Let's say
right,
that.
And that honestly has kind of become a horror movie trope, if you will. The whole it was buried on an Indian burial ground, so it's haunted, and it's just something you see in a lot of horror movies now.
And so, of course, they start to explain, where they can go, and they don't really tell them where they can't go, just show them all the rooms that they'll need to really focus on and do maintenance to, show them the boiler room, how that works, and they go into this massive kitchen, which made sense. It's a hotel housing a number of people. They need to have a decent-sized kitchen to maintain and take care of all of the guests in a timely manner. And so that's where they meet Scatman Crothers' character, Dick Halloran, who is one of the head chefs at the hotel. He's on his way out and wants to at least meet the family and, say, hey, how's it going? You guys going to be the caretakers for this winter? Fantastic. And so, of course, he's walking with Danny and Wendy. Jack is off with the manager finishing up some paperwork, most likely.
Right.
And this is where we really get of course, earlier on in the film, we get to see this Tony with Danny, and we understand, okay, this kid's got a little bit more than meets the eye, maybe even some partially psychic abilities, because, of course, he tells Wendy, or at least he tells himself in the mirror, I should say. Wendy's waiting on the phone.
Right.
Tells himself in the mirror he's already got the job. We're going to get a phone call here in a second. Wendy gets the phone call. It's Jack to say, yep, I've got the job. You guys are going to love it. So we can tell right away that he's special.
Right.
We'll say that. There's a moment when they're in the dry storage goods closet. Scatman Crothers' character, Dick Halloran, has a telepathic moment of, hey, would you like some ice cream after this? And of course, Danny's the only person that can hear this. And even before that, he calls Danny Doc, which is his nickname given to him by Wendy.
Right.
And she asks, well, how did you know that we call him Doc? Like, we call him that, but we've just met you.
Right.
And he tries to play it off like, oh, he just seems like the Doc.
Definitely. He has to play it off and say that he either seems like a doc or he heard them say it one time when they got there. It's interesting. The whole prospect of the film is weird in and of itself, just that they're taking care of this hotel with nobody else there. They have no way out, and they even tell them, half the time the phone lines get torn down by the storms and the snow.
And there's no way to repair them.
So they are literally stuck in this hotel for that amount of months. And thankfully, they show them the kitchen and show them the pantry and everything. And she's like, there's only 3 of us. We don't need all this food. And they're like, well, you're going to be stuck here. You have no way out other than a CB radio.
And a snowcat.
Right. For emergencies. And so I guess they stocked the hotel pantry for this family while it's closed down, which another thing about it is kind of odd. I've never heard of a hotel that can close down for that long and still
survive with business.
Yeah, still sustain, business.
But, movie logic.
Well, yeah, true. And so Danny and Halloran, they decide to sit down and have some ice cream while Wendy and Jack go off with the manager to do the rest of the tour. And this is where Halloran tells Danny why he's able to talk to him without actually talking to him and everything like that.
And he more or less explains to Danny what shining is, and he explains that when he was younger, hollering, he had conversations with his grandma without ever moving their mouths, and that she referred to it as though he had a shine, or they called it shining. And so then he also mentions that the hotel, in and of itself, has a way of shining, or using its own shine.
Right.
And that Danny needs to be leery of this, and of course they have a conversation about whether or not it's a good or a bad place. And he mentions that, well, sometimes places have a bad past and those things stick around.
Right.
You can see things in the future, but sometimes you can also see things that happened in the past.
Right.
Because when they arrive, even before they meet Scatman Crothers, Danny has a moment where he sees those creepy twins right there in the doorway, and it's like, okay, something's up with that. Right out of the gate, something's going to be up with this hotel from the get-go.
Oh yeah, because there's not supposed to be anybody else there.
No, not at all. And so you're like, okay, well, what's this going to turn into? Where's this going to go? And from that conversation, of course, head chef leaves. He's not sticking around. He knows it's time to go, and he is of course concerned for the family, but hopes that they can make it through this winter and essentially survive and make it through. And from there, we get some time wipes of where it says 1 month later, 2 months later, and they start to show how the hotel of horror, we'll call it, really preys on Jack Torrance's previous alcoholism and rage and underlying psychosis, also preys on Danny's fear and just his innocence as a child, and then furthermore really preys on Wendy's overall suffrage of being in an abusive relationship,
right?
Also having fear for Danny because she knows he's not quite right.
Right. It's odd because it seems like the hotel is almost possessing Jack, because all the stuff that happens, and like him going into the big ballroom and going to the bar and sitting there, which they've already told him, all the alcohol has been removed from the hotel when they leave.
Essentially as a means of insurance.
Right, because it's alcohol is expensive too. And so these things are happening to him and he's seeing things, and there are instances where he thinks to himself, I'm losing my mind, but he doesn't really react like I would think I would react in a situation like that, which would be, oh no, we're leaving. The first time something happened, I would be out,
But quite the opposite with Jack Torrance. He just dives deeper and deeper into this crazy deep end.
Right.
And it just immerses himself and, almost kind of becomes in tune with the hotel itself and what it wants and its desires, and that's essentially to feast upon that craziness and perhaps even the family's souls, because that's why Mr. Grady went off and did what he did with his acts and his unfortunate family's situation. And of course, from there we also get to see what Danny is seeing. So he's big wheeling it around the hallways, appearing to have a good time.
Right.
And of course, again, comes into contact with these twins. And I should back up a little bit. In their conversation when they had the ice cream, Danny asks the caller, what is room 237? And so he briefly explains, some things are better left unsaid or not touched. Whatever you do, don't go into that room, leave it be.
Right.
And so he wheels by and he notices room 237 in one scene, and it's not open. He goes to jostle the doorknob and lets it be, drives off. But
right.
Something is amiss with room 237. And we should note in the Stephen King novel from our research, the room was actually 217. So for whatever reason, Kubrick went with 237 in the movie. I'm sure there's an underlying reason. I think there's even a documentary on room 237.
There is.
Feel free to check that out.
I haven't watched it, but I saw it on Amazon Prime when I was watching this movie.
And having watched The Shining and now Dr. Sleep, it's one that I would actually like to go back and watch just to see if maybe it fills in some gaps or has a deeper meaning, because I believe even a lot of people that watch the film will have a debate as to what really went down in room 237, because later on in the film, of course, Danny Torrance winds up in room 237, has the lady in the tub, super creepy, comes after him. At least that's who we're believed to have caused the strangulation marks on
right.
his neck. And of course Danny makes it out semi-okay, but obviously visibly scarred and mentally scarred, I'm sure, from that experience as a kid. And of course Wendy thinks that for a second it might have been Jack Torrance in kind of a fit of rage, and then she realizes, no, this was a lady, there's somebody else in this hotel. They all start to realize that this place is just, a weird, crazy place.
Right. Well, she sees him with the bruises and everything, and she immediately makes the connection to Jack, thinking that he did something, and he's like sitting there like, no, I didn't do anything. I've been here the whole time. So she takes him and like puts him to bed and says to Jack, don't you ever touch him again, or something to that effect. And then a little while later, she comes back to Jack without Danny and tells him, there's somebody in that room. He told me that there was a woman in that room. And so then Jack is thinking she's crazy, but he decides to go and check it out to make sure everything's okay. So he has moments in the movie where he is still there, and then there's other moments where he just completely loses it and just isn't in our reality anymore, basically.
No, he's not. And one of those scenes that you can see that is when, of course, Danny wants to go up and get a fire engine or some type of toy to play with. He says, oh, I'll be really quiet, I'll tiptoe, I won't wake up Dad, I know he's been busy.
Right.
With his writing. And, of course, Jack Torrance is already awake, upright, when he gets into the room, creepily so.
Yeah, that was a very creepy scene.
And he says, Dad, I just want to get my fire engine, I don't want to bother you. And he's like, well, come here first before you do. And then he lets him know, I'd never hurt you, right? But he says it in quite a creepy tone and gives him quite a creepy look and hug. And I think at that moment you start to realize that Jack Torrance has really gone off the deep end now and just kind of get worse from there before it gets better.
Right. And I mean, I guess we should back up a minute and talk about the fact that he does go to that room and check it out, and he sees a woman in there, but not the same way that Danny saw her.
No, not quite. She reverts back
at least
to
at
her,
first.
Right. She reverts back to her much prettier form.
Right.
If you will.
Her living form, basically.
But even then, once he approaches, then she actually morphs a little bit into what Danny saw, and that's when he realizes the terror and the fear that he went through and how twisted that this hotel really is.
Right, and I think that's one of the parts where Jack is like, I'm losing my mind, what's going on? And just one interesting thing I did find out about The Shining in doing the research and everything, this hotel actually exists. It's not, I don't think it's called the Overlook Hotel, but it is an actual hotel, and there are people that say it is haunted, and people that actually work there say it's haunted. I've watched a lot of videos on like YouTube where people go to this hotel and, do like ghost hunting type things, and apparently Stephen King stayed there, and it was said that like the very next day after staying there one night, he hadn't written the whole book or anything like that, but he had a whole outline in his mind about this hotel and this story.
Well, that should speak volumes in and of itself. If Stephen King, of all people, was able to be inspired to make an outline, that place had to be pretty creepy.
Right.
I should say this place is pretty creepy.
Yeah, exactly.
And so to get back to the creepy Overlook Hotel, obviously, of course, Jack Torrance's character is becoming increasingly more psychotic and deranged and aggressive. And before he really goes off the rails and we get to some of the more iconic scenes from The Shining, we see him overlooking a mini model of a hedge maze, and this particular hedge maze obviously has already been planted and built out in the courtyard there of the Overlook Hotel, and that's where Danny and Wendy are walking around and just kind of having fun, mother son time in the maze, not getting lost. They know where they're going, and so of course they figure it out, and you get a nice overlook shot of the model of the maze, and Kubrick does this on purpose to show, of course, the metaphor that the mind can very much be maze-like, or in this case, in Jack Torrance's case, he might even himself be a rat in the maze trying to find his way out, and of course he keeps having these visions of hotel staff members from the past and this bartender, Lloyd, and conversations with the previous Mr. Grady about how, his family is the problem and he needs to take them out and there's just no other end in sight but chopping them off.
Well, and he becomes more and more attached to the hotel and wants to stay, and meanwhile all this stuff happening is really stressing out Wendy, and she sees what's happening to Danny and all the stuff that's happened to him, and so she starts feeling like they need to leave more and more, as the story goes on, and the hotel even tells tells Jack that they're trying to leave, they're trying to sabotage this basically for you, and so that's one of the ways the hotel staff that aren't actually there are convincing him to do away with his family. And it's just really sad on one hand, but on the other, he was already so messed up and weird seeming before all this happened that I didn't really ever have sympathy for his character.
No, you don't really feel sympathetic for Jack Torrance because, again, throughout the entire film, he is very standoffish, just not your ideal father figure.
Right.
Just seems like he was using alcoholism before as his means of escape from that family dynamic that he ultimately didn't appear to ever want to be a part of.
Right.
And so, of course, you do, of course, on the other side of that, feel very much so concerned for Wendy and Danny, and you wonder if and how they're going to get out of this overlooked hotel. I mean, they're up in the Rockies.
Right. Meanwhile, it's getting harder and harder for them to leave because of the weather and the snow, and they told them, that they're going to be stuck there. And so she's like in a panic wanting to leave the sooner the better because she knows that there's going to come a time when they can't get out.
And so, of course, this all boils up to a head where she eventually approaches and tries to figure out, what Jack has been up to before she ultimately enacts her plan to try and leave and at least try to talk to him a little bit before it had that conversation of, hey, you can stay, but I'm leaving. And she brings a bat with her just to be safe because he's gotten pretty aggressive to this point. And then, of course, that leads to that conversation not going down well at all because she finds out that this whole time he hasn't really been writing a book. He's just been writing the same psychotic sentence over and over and over. And so he does the famous scene of chasing her up the stairs. She says, get away. Ends up whacking him in the head with the baseball bat. He topples down the stairs.
Right.
And so she drags him into the dry goods, which, if she was really going to do it right, that's the only part about the movie that kind of bothered me. So twofold here. So you would think if she was going to really do it right, she would have dragged him into the freezer and clamped that shut.
Well, yeah, but I don't think that she was really wanting to, kill him. I think she was just wanting to get him away from them and have him locked up where he couldn't hurt them.
And that's fair. And I guess, in that moment, of course, they are still husband and wife. I'm sure she still cares about him at some level.
Well, and he was obviously already has a past of abuse. So she was already in that mindset that, she tries to deal with it as much as she can before she finally leaves,
True.
Which is a common thing with those kinds of relationships.
Right, it's a good point to bring up. And so, of course, locks him up in the dry goods storage area. And so that's the other part that bothered me only slightly.
Right.
And that's because, of course, later on, Jack Torrance wakes up, and the hotel apparitions mention, looks like you're having trouble taking care of the problem that we talked to you about. That, of course, being his family. Mm-hmm. And he says it won't be a problem again. I just need another chance to get out of here and take care of it once and for all.
Right.
And, of course, the hotel, air quotes, unlocks the dry storage. He gets out, finds the axe that has now become so iconic in the later scene.
Right.
And so, of course, he then goes after Wendy and Danny. But before that, she she tells him while he's in the dry storage, I'm leaving, I'm taking Danny. We'll send help to come back for you, but we're out of here.
Right.
And he says, well, there'll be a surprise waiting for you, because this whole time he's been undermining her plans to escape.
Right.
Because he's been pulling out the batteries in the radio, their only means of communication to the outside world and the local authorities. And then the one and only snowcat that they have, he has completely destroyed to where it's not functional or drivable.
And meanwhile, throughout all of this, Dick Halloran is down in Florida, and I guess his psychic connection with Danny leads him to feel that something's not right. And so he starts trying to call the hotel, and he's not getting any answers. And so he then calls the, I guess, rangers or the park rangers in the area and asks them if they could try and get in touch with the hotel to make sure everything's okay. Obviously, they can't get in touch with them because Jack has destroyed the radio. That was their only way of getting in touch. And so Dick hollering because he hasn't heard anything and they can't get in touch with him. He knows something's wrong. So he decides to go back and try and help them, which I really like. I like at first when you meet that character, it's really weird, obviously, because he's psychically talking to Danny. But I really grew to really like that character. I mean, he comes across weird at first, but you can tell that he's really a good person, you know.
And he definitely starts out, Dick Halloran, played by Scatman Crothers, as a creepy kind of chef, and then he does end up becoming this genuine character that is kind of like a conscience in a way,
right,
for Danny, or a guide, I guess, kind of his shine guide, if you want to call it that,
right.
And so all the while he's trying, of course, to race against the clock to try and get up there to the Overlook Hotel before anything bad happens.
Right.
And right about that time as he's close to arriving, that's about the time that Jack Torrance goes on his tear and chases them down, goes to the room. They realize there's no way out. They're trying to figure out a way out. They get locked into their bathroom, I believe, of their family room that the hotel gave to them.
Mm.
And Wendy realizes, okay, this window is our only way out. Let's get it open. Of course, the blizzard that happened before has frozen it slightly, so she can't open up the window all the way, but cracks it enough for Danny to slide out where the snowbound is piled up all the way to the window to give you an idea of how bad this blizzard gets. And so they're on the second or third floor, I think, at the hotel.
I think it's the second. I mean, it looked like the second floor.
And so Danny slides down safely. Of course, unfortunately, Wendy is not able to. All the while, Jack Torrance has already chopped down and through one door and is working his way to the bathroom, which, of course, iconically has the red rum written on there.
Right.
So, of course, to backpedal just slightly, there's a really good scene where Danny kind of has this spiral into becoming strictly just Tony there for a little while, his other alter psyche, and repeats red rum over and over and over again based on the events that happened in 237. It kind of just sends him into this state of shock.
Right.
Danny, he says, is no longer here. It's just Tony, and keeps repeating this red rum. First watch, you're like, okay, well, what's so important about red rum?
Right.
And then, of course, there's a mirror scene. There's a lot of, parallels in this film. I think, again, Kubrick does that on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, you see in the mirror that red rum backwards ends up being murder. It's actually murder. Red rum is murder backwards.
Right.
And so, of course, Wendy picks up on that, and again, that's her way of realizing, oh, okay, yep, it's time to get the heck out of here.
Right.
And so, Jack Torrance is chopping through the bathroom door, and we get that little split in the wood, and his face is just able to fit through, and he drops the line that's so famous now of "Here's Johnny."
Yeah.
And she freaks out, slices his hand, and about that time, that's when we realize that Danny, while he, yes, made it out of the hotel, ends up ultimately coming back in, I'd say out of fear for making sure that his mom could get out safely.
Right.
Because you wonder, like, oh, why wouldn't the kid just run off? But then, of course, it's a kid in a snowstorm. What's he going to do?
That, and his mom didn't come out of the window behind him, so obviously, I mean, I could see where it would be understandable, even if your mom told you to go. I mean, at that point, that's his only parent.
Right, and his only way out of that situation.
Right.
And so by about that time, Dick Halloran has arrived at the hotel. He's walking through the hallways to try and find Danny. And unfortunately, what he ends up finding is the blunt end of Jack Torrance's axe, because Jack realizes that, Danny is in the house. He's running through, in the hotel, I should say.
Right.
Running through, screaming his name, trying to find him. And eventually, ultimately, Danny runs out to this maze that he's familiar with, and just such a smart move by such a young kid to go there realizing he's got a chance to at least weave his way in and out to where he can get to safety, and if nothing else, to buy Wendy some time to get out herself. And so, of course, what he ends up doing is covering up his tracks. That's the smart move. And so Jack Torrance is not able to find him, just continues to run around in the cold, screaming and freezing. And, of course, Danny is able to make it back to the snow track, finds Wendy. They go off into the distance.
Thankfully, Dick Halloran had brought another snow cat up when he was coming to help him. And so Danny gets out of the maze and Wendy finally gets out of the hotel. They get in the snowcat and they take off. And then the next thing you see is the next morning
It's just an ice-frozen Jack Torrance who is clearly not with us anymore. He has passed on. And then, of course, from there, the film really comes to a close, and we get, in my opinion, one of the better twists that I've seen in a while. And up until that point, watching the movie, I thought to myself, yep, I can see why this is a cult classic, typical 80s horror film, very well done. I get it.
Right.
And it pans in to one of the walls on the hotel, and it's sort of like a memoir wall of all kinds of past history and events that they've hosted in the hotel. And it zooms right into the middle on one picture in particular, and it slowly starts to build in, and then focuses on what appears to be a Jack Torrance lookalike. And it's dated 1921. It's a 4th of July event, as if to imply that he's been there the whole time. And, of course, at one point in the movie, one of them says, well, you've always been the caretaker, the apparition or illusion or hallucination, whatever you want to call it, that Jack Torrance is seeing. And from all the research that I've done, it's one of two things in my mind, or two theories that are out as far as what the twist ending means. So, of course, Kubrick himself said that the picture suggests potentially that Jack was a reincarnation of one of the apparitions, and of course, or potentially even Mr. Grady taking over a new body, and doing the same thing again, trying to unsuccessfully murder his family with an axe. Or could very well be, and this is the theory that I think I accept a little bit more, because it just kind of makes a little bit more sense to me. Because in this sense, Jack Torrance existed before the hotel, so the reincarnation would be a little bit hard, I think, to make sense of. And of course, that could be just my misunderstanding of reincarnation.
I mean, the way I would think of it is that he was reincarnated, and so he was destined to live out the same events as Grady, basically.
Could be.
And so, at that, he was living a normal life up until he got to the point where Grady went insane and killed his family, and he just repeated the...
And so that's where the rebirth happened, more or less.
Basically.
Or, the other theory is that Jack Torrance's soul was eaten or devoured by the hotel, which is what it wanted all along. And so then by doing so, he becomes...
Part of the hotel.
Part of the hotel, part of the crew, part of the ship. So, and of course, that ends The Shining, and that brings us right into Dr. Sleep, the sequel, which we both enjoyed thoroughly. It's one that we highly recommend that you go watch if you get a chance to go see it. It's just really well done.
But before we move on to that, I would say that the one thing that I struggled with the most in The Shining was all of the really loud string sound effects and music. Like, the music is great. I don't have a problem with the music. The score is beautifully done. But throughout the entire movie, like, I know a lot of horror movies use sound effects and string music and stuff like that to invoke terror and stress. But, like, there were points, and I think you even told me the same for you, where I had to, like, turn it down because it was literally throughout the entire movie. It didn't feel like there was ever a time where, like, the loud string sounds and stuff went away.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's the first actual interaction with Room 237 by Danny, where it's just this high-pitched frequency, and it plays for what feels like forever, but it's probably more like a solid 2.5 minutes. And it got to the point to where when I was watching it on my TV, I had to turn the volume down into the single digits, and I could still hear it audibly, to give you an idea of just how loud and stressful this particular soundbite gets. It kind of raises your heart level a little bit, intentionally so, given it's a horror film.
Well, and I would say that it was more than likely meant to be that way, just because it makes you uncomfortable and it's annoying, and you're watching a scary movie, so that's the intention. They want you to be stressed and unnerved, basically. And so I see why they did it, but at the same time, it was just constant, and I've never watched a horror movie where it was just the entire, at least to me, it felt like it was the entire time.
And I think the funniest part for me in watching Dr. Sleep together was, of course, it starts out with a pretty solid heartbeat drum. And I just looked over at you and thought, well, here we go again. And they do actually continue that heartbeat.
They do
throughout most of the film.
I didn't have near as much of an issue with that because it was a lot lower, and
I was going to say that the frequency there is more of a bass,
right,
as opposed to a screech, and it's still just as effective.
Right, and so that worked a lot better for me than the sound effects in The Shining. So it may be a nitpicky thing, but to me, it made it difficult to watch the movie.
And of course, now to go back into Dr. Sleep, like we said, it begins where The Shining left off. So we get a nice overlook shot of a camper in 1980, pan down to that, much in the same way that we get that overlook of the Colorado wilderness in the opening of The Shining. So nice callback right out of the gate.
Right.
A lot of callbacks in Dr. Sleep to The Shining that we'll get to in just a moment. And so, of course, we see that I want to say we're in Florida, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't remember.
I could be wrong. No, that's where Danny and Wendy end up moving to because they don't want to see snow ever again after their experience in Colorado. So they go to a warmer climate. And we very first get introduced to the Knot, which is essentially kind of a creepy, vampire-esque, semi-immortal cult that has been around for centuries, or at least one of their members has anyway, Grandpa Flick, that we wind up finding out more about later in the film. But the first member that we're introduced to is Rose the Hat, which is a little interesting choice for the name, but her name is Rose and she is wearing a hat.
Right.
So that's what she chose to go with. And if anything, I'd say it's probably to make her more approachable to children that shine, because that's seemingly who they, for the most part, feed off of. And that's usually because I would imagine children that shine are a little bit more powerful than adults that shine.
Right.
Or shining is something that as you get older, you're not as in tune with it as you are when you're younger. And so she comes across a little girl who has the ability to shine. Her name is Violet, and she introduces them to other members of the Knot, and unfortunately we find out very quickly that, of course, these are not
nice people.
Not nice people, shall we say. Good job. That's a nice one. I'll allow that. And so we don't have a drum here. We did the drum roll. But, of course, what they end up doing is sucking out, almost like a vampire, what they call steam. Or in this case, they inflict pain upon the child, which causes them to then scream or languish out. And so then, of course, their shine, or more or less their soul, becomes visibly sucked out of them. And so then they put that into canisters, and that's essentially how they are able to live over the centuries, is off of these tormented children and or adolescent or adults who shine.
Right, it basically gives them, I guess, power, and also repairs or rejuvenates their bodies and keeps them alive longer. And the reason they go after children is, for one, it's easier to scare children, and they say that the steam or the shine is better when they're scared or in pain. And as you grow up, they even mention that your shine becomes, I guess, worn out or not as pure and not as strong, basically.
Like a used car.
Right. And so that's why they go after children, basically. And so it's a very messed up scene, but it doesn't really show you anything. That girl just ends up becoming missing. And from there, we cut back to Wendy and Danny, and it's basically right after they leave the Overlook after the events of the first movie took place. And, you know, they're together. It's just the mom and son now. They're trying to live a normal life. And I will say that they did an okay job finding people that looked similar to the people that played them in the first movie. But I really got to give it up to the girl that played Wendy in Dr. Sleep, Alex Esso. She did a great job. She didn't really look very much like her, but her voice sounded almost identical to Shelley Duvall in the scenes that she had. And so they're living in an apartment together, and, you know, Danny's still kind of traumatized from the events of the first movie. Come to find out that Dick Halloran still visits him, still talks to him, and kind of becomes like a spirit guide almost to help Danny and help him figure out how to deal with the stuff that's going on in his life. Because Danny's still seeing things from the hotel, like the spirits or or whatever you want to call it, are still bothering him and still coming to see him. And so he's talking to Dick Halloran, and Dick tells him about a way to deal with what he's seeing. And it's basically Dick tells him to go into his mind and imagine a box and imagine putting these things, these spirits, or whatever you want to call them, into the box and locking the box up, and just using your mind to keep them from being able to bother you. And after that happens, he's sitting with his mom, they're watching TV, and he says, well, I don't think he even says that he needs to go to the restroom. He just kind of gets up and walks away. And the mom's kind of worried, like she doesn't know what's going on, but he goes to the bathroom and sees the same old dead lady come out of the bathtub. But this time he's prepared because Dick Halloran helped him, and he just shows him go into the bathroom with this ghost and turn around and close the door. And so basically what he does is he takes those spirits and locks them away in his mind to keep them from bothering him.
And it's a neat scene because when Dick Halloran is explaining how to put these spirits in the box, you very much understand right away that while they have left the Overlook Hotel has not left them.
Right.
And in this specific case, has not left Danny. And so, to Halloran's point, he has to come up with a way to deal with this. If he's going to continue to shine as he lives out his life, he needs to have a trick up his sleeve or a way to make it through everyday life so essentially he doesn't go crazy.
Basically, yeah. And so he does, he takes care of it, and then we kind of get a time jump to today's time. And we see Danny. Unfortunately, he's become a lot like his father in that he's clearly an alcoholic.
And clearly, he's not really hanging out with the best crowd,
right,
shall we say. So struggling very hard, not only with, of course, shining as he gets older, but of course at this point he has locked up most of those demons from the Overlook Hotel. But he's also dealing with his own demons on a personal note. And so, of course, we see him the next morning with, in this case, it's a lady from the bar that he met.
Right.
And he starts to recap his actions throughout the night, wakes up with somewhat of a black eye and some bruises, maybe a cut or two. And at this moment he just realizes, okay, enough is enough. And this is set in about 2011, where we're at in the film from the jump from 1980. And it's a kind of a semi-sad scene because you get the lady from the night before, and she seems to have had a vomiting-induced reaction to whatever her drug of choice was.
Right.
And then, of course, he realizes, all right, well, this isn't a situation I need to be a part of. Let's get out of here. Halloran makes an appearance and is like, hey, whoa, wait a minute. As he starts to rifle through his wallet and realizes his money's gone.
Right.
He assumes, okay, well, she must have taken and spent my money. I'm going to refill my wallet with her money.
Right.
And he's like, you're going to just take her money? Like, he's, again, kind of that conscience figure. Mm-hmm. He's like, that's not us, come on, you're better than that, Danny. Let's get out of here. He hears a baby, realizes, oh, okay, I need to take care of this. Goes ahead, puts the baby back in with, assumedly, the mother. And
right.
Dips out and realizes, okay, wake up call, I need help.
Right.
So he winds up in New Hampshire, of all places, to try and get away from it all on the East Coast, and he eventually runs into a local there called Billy Freeman, and he's looking at a teeny town, I believe they call it.
Right.
And so it's kind of another callback to The Shining, where it's literally a miniature model of the town square that they're in the process of building, and Billy Freeman says, you just get in off the bus. And so they have this exchange, and he can tell that he's somebody that needs help. He's like, well, I've got a group that I go to. I think they'd be able to help you out quite a bit. Let me, take you under my wing, so to speak. And so they build a relationship over about an 8-year span. And
right.
So, of course, the movie does one last time jump to 2019, or present day. And so by that point, he has been about 8 years sober. He's getting up and giving his coin speech in the AA meeting and saying that this isn't only for him, but it's also for his dad, Jack Torrance. So
right.
Another callback to The Shining. And so, of course, he's starting to feel really good about himself. And we should backtrack a little bit. Back in 2011, we not only catch up with Danny Torrance, but we also get introduced to the other main character of this film, and that is Abra Stone. So a young girl at a birthday party, a magician is doing magic tricks with some spoons, and it's kind of a funny scene because, but also creepy in the same light, because Abra says, "Oh, I can do that too with spoons," and the magician plays it off and is like, "Well, that's nice, sweetie. Thanks for sharing."
Right.
All the meanwhile, inside the kitchen, we literally see all of the silverware, forks, knives, spoons, and all, either levitating or going straight up into the ceiling.
Right. They're all stuck in the ceiling, and her parents walk into the kitchen and don't realize it at first, but she comes in, the little girl comes in, Abra, and is talking to the parents, and the mother, I guess, notices it on the ceiling and tells the father to look up, and they see all the silverware stuck to the ceiling or floating, and they turn and look at their daughter and realize that I guess she has shown some abilities before that, and it kind of creeped them out. And I guess it was the way they looked at her, like, kind of creeped out. All of a sudden, all the spoons and silverware just fall. Like, she undoes it because she sees her parents freaking out. And it's quite a jump scare in and of itself, because all the silverware falls and just crashes and makes loud bangs. Then we go back to Danny, and just to backtrack a little bit, when Danny first gets there and meets Billy Freeman, he tells him about the group and that they can help him, and so he goes to the group, and they're able to help him get a place to stay, and they help him get a job. Fast forward 8 years, he's doing a lot better. He's clean cut. He has a place to live, and he's got a steady job, which he works at I guess it's a hospice, basically, for elderly people that are, on their way out. And so there's a cat there at the hospice, and I guess it's kind of known that whenever that cat roams into one of the residents' rooms, that cat senses and figures out that that person's time is near, basically.
That's also where he earns the nickname Dr. Sleep, because one of the patients says doctor, and he's like, "I'm not a doctor," and he's like, "No, you're the right kind of doctor that I need in this moment. It's time for me to go to sleep."
Right, because he basically goes into one of the rooms when the cat goes in there, and he's talking to the elderly person, and the person's telling him, "I'm scared, I don't want to go." And I'm pretty sure that first person is who tells him that about the cat, that it's known here that when the cat goes in to the room, that person's time is near. And so this person that he went into the room for, he went in to get the cat out, but the person was awake and was talking and started talking to Danny and told him that he was scared, and didn't want to die. And so Danny sits down beside him and starts telling him things about his life and about the patient's life. Like, Danny can, he has these abilities to see people's past and see different things and talk to people that have passed on. And so he uses that to comfort the people as they're passing away. And it's a really touching and cool scene. And so that basically becomes his job after that. He's a janitor there, but I guess on the side, whenever he sees the cat go into one of the rooms, he goes in and he comforts the patient until they pass.
And so, of course, one night in particular, he comes back to the apartment where he's living, and the previous tenant had the wall built in such a way where it could be a chalkboard wall. I believe he was a math teacher of sorts.
Right.
And he notices this message on this chalkboard, and so it just simply says hello with a smiley face in the O, and we realize that is what's written by Abra on a piece of paper. And so she is able to telepathically communicate, or shine, FaceTime, just if you want to call it that.
Right.
Mind time with Danny across thousands of miles.
Which is, not odd necessarily, but I wonder how she made the connection with him. Did she just feel his presence?
Well, I'd say so, because her mom at one point later in the movie mentions that her brain is or her mind, I should say, is kind of like a radio.
Right.
And sometimes she picks up some not so nice stations. And so I feel like she was probably just broadcasting.
So she's kind of like Professor X.
In a way. She's kind of like a Cerebro, but for shining. I would think about it in that light. That's a great way to look at it. from there, we notice that they start to have this connection and messages back and forth, very innocent at first. But then, of course, we get pulled back into this very real evil presence that's still out there. Of course, the Knot is still alive and well, but they're trying to recruit some new members because the well side is not as nice as it was once before. There's not as many people that shine anymore, not as many young people that shine anymore, so they're sort of, no pun intended, running out of steam.
Right.
Quite literally.
Well, they even, it kind of sounds funny when they say it. Like, I don't know that they necessarily mean it as a joke in the movie, but when they're talking to each other, they even say, you know, there's not as many people out there that shine. We don't know what it is, if it's all the cell phones or the you know, social media or Netflix. I mean, it's just a really funny thing to hear them say, but I mean, it's almost like, I mean, it sounded like they were being serious. It didn't sound like they were joking, but I guess just thinking that maybe that interfered with that somehow, like the cell phone
right, or the shining has been stunted, essentially.
Right. And
absolutely. And I think that was Crow Daddy that was saying that to Rose the Hat, so it was kind of a funny scene. But he did actually seem quite serious because at the end of the day, it's their livelihood.
Right.
That's how they've been able to live for so long. And we get a cool nugget later on in the film as far as their mythos and that how are they able to, or how long have they been around. Right. And so Grandpa Flick is the oldest one in the group. He's somewhat of a seance leader when they turn certain people that shine. That's usually the two choices they have, is they either turn somebody to their team that has an ability or a specific shine, or they of course wind up devouring them for their streams and pain and steam and bottle them up.
Right.
And so
it's really weird because it's almost like exactly like you would think of a vampire, just instead of blood, it's this steam.
And going back to Grandpa Flick's character in particular, of course, later on we find out that, like I said before, these are semi-immortal beings, so they can actually die.
Right.
And so, of course, because there isn't so much shine available or steam available for them to feed off of or live off of, he ends up not making it, phasing out. I believe they call it cycling.
Yeah.
In the movie, if I'm not mistaken. And so you see him laying down, and quite literally he is starting to phase in and out of human form into a skeletal spirit soul form.
Right.
And of course Rose tries to comfort him and says, listen, you were one of the first ones to start this group. You've been around for centuries. You've watched empires rise and fall. You have gotten steam from kings and princes. And so you get a sense right away that this has been going on. This group has been around for centuries because evidently Grandpa Flick dates back to at least the Roman Empire.
Right.
To the best of our knowledge, possibly even the Egyptians, who knows. And so, of course, he cycles out and bursts into a pile of nothing more than pure steam. And it's interesting as well, because you brought this up, Charlie, before we did the episode, that you see how vampire-esque and animalistic they are, because they see a free meal, and it's like, it's sad that they lost a member of their cult, so to speak, if you want to call it that. And then they just go right to town and say, well, hey, he's gone, we've got to sustain ourselves. It's a free meal.
It was just weird, because, like, they're all sad and upset that he's dying or whatever, but then he turns into pure steam, and they just all pounce, like, really quickly and very animalistically, like it was just, oh, okay. So...
And of course, before that, they do end up turning a particular individual that shines, and so Crow Daddy and Rose go out for a recruitment, if you will, in a local theater somewhere, and they jump around, of course, in some parts of the state, so they're traveling, trying to look where they can, because it is so rare to find someone that shines, and they find one that they deem as a pusher, or one that can shine and twist someone's willpower.
Right.
And so this particular character is called Snakebite Andy. And so the reason she's called that is because she lures older men who more or less are into younger women pedophilia.
Right.
Lures them into theaters and, essentially tells them to fall into a deep sleep. She winds up cutting 2 holes into their neck to make a point or a message. And of course, in her situation, rightfully so. And of course, they pick up on this and realize, okay, she's got the ability to control people's willpower, and we could use her on our team. So let's go ahead and try and convince her to turn and join the knot. And so they wind up doing just that. And so she becomes a part of their little crew.
Right. Yeah, and she was an interesting character because just like she doesn't seem like a bad person at first. The things she's doing to people that you can tell have obviously hurt people she knows or hurt her in the past. Not the particular people, but somebody like them. And so it's just, at first she seems like an okay person, and then
starts out with good intentions, but the evil very quickly consumes her, and she does become part of their unit.
Right.
And so from there, now that we of course understand who they are and what they are, we can get back into, of course, the more or less the bulk of the film, and that's where Danny starts to become more aware of who Abra is and her abilities, and realizes that she is more or less just like him, but certainly on a more powerful scale. Then, of course, to go back to the Knot, they are out there on the search still, now that they've turned one more that can really... This is essentially the other big reason as to why they need a pusher, so to speak. And I should mention that it's neat in this film, they give a description to some of those that shine. So, of course, Snakebite Andy is a pusher. We find out later that Abra and Danny are lookers. They can look into the past, the future, actual moments that are happening, and we get a tragic moment there later in the film where we're in Iowa, I believe it is, and they find someone that can shine, much like Abra and Danny. And of course, they say in the stands it's a baseball game that we see, and the dad's like, yeah, this kid always gets a hit. It's like he can read the pitcher's mind.
Right.
And of course, we realize watching the film, well, yeah, quite literally, he can read the pitcher's mind and read the pitches.
Right.
And it's a scene that bothered me for a few reasons. Obviously, it's hard to watch, but it's put in there for a horror film. I get that. But it's the fact that the kid was walking home by himself near a cornfield. I get that it's Iowa. I get that it's the country. Some things are more laid back. But it's 2019. It'd be one thing if this scene were, back in 1980 and it was a flashback. Okay, different times. But what parents let their kid, even if you're like 0.5 miles away on Google Maps, lets their kid just walk back to the house? It's like, he says in the scene, it's not that far from home. I don't need a ride. I'll just continue walking to my house. No thanks. But I get it. Movie logic.
I mean, honestly, that part didn't bother me as much. I get where you're coming from, but it's just, there are still some safe places in the world where that can happen. But yeah, the whole, basically they capture him and take him, and that whole scene was hard to watch. I mean, because obviously the way they do it is they have to scare and torture and hurt the person that they're trying to get the steam from.
Right, to extract.
Right. So we won't go into detail about what they do, but they don't shy away from it. And it made me very uncomfortable. I mean,
just to be clear, this particular film, there are certain scenes that are definitely not for the faint of heart. So just FYI.
Right. And I mean, and stuff like that doesn't normally bother me or anything. But when it's a kid, I think that's a whole new level for pretty much everybody.
Absolutely. I mean, different mindset entirely.
Right.
And so, of course, during this, Abra is able to use her mind as a radio, as her mom said earlier, and she picks up a station that is not comfortable.
Right.
And as much as she would not like to witness this, she sees the whole thing go down. At this point, Rose feels this because it's believed or implied that Rose herself used to be a looker before she turned over to the Knot.
Right.
And became kind of their quasi-leader, other than, of course, Grandpa Flick.
Mm-hmm.
And so she realizes, we've got a looker. And this one is the most powerful I've felt ever.
Right.
Because they said that it's essentially the kid in Iowa and picking up some others like Snakebite Danny were small fish. They're frying small fish.
Right.
They need to find a whale or a big catch.
One, and Abra is like all the way on the other side of the country, and so like all the members, or at least the Crow and Rose, are sitting there talking about it, and they're both very surprised that she can see from, all the way on the other side of the country. And so they know that she's more powerful than they've come across in a very long time, if ever. And so she witnesses the whole thing, and I don't know if she can feel it or if she's just as uncomfortable seeing it as we are, but she basically has an episode while it's happening, and all of a sudden the wall in Danny's apartment like just bursts in cracks and just in big bold letters that says murder on the wall. And Danny is asleep and he gets awakened by this happening.
And I was going to say, he recognizes in the mirror that it says red rum.
Right.
And then, of course, has to flip around and see that it says murder. And that was, again, a nice parallel callback to Shining, where, of course, he initially wrote out red rum to flip it to murder, and vice versa. So that was a nice callback. And I should also say, another neat little callback is that the address for where Abra lives is actually 1980.
Right.
Which, of course, is the year that The Shining came out, and also, of course, the set-in year of the same movie.
Right.
And so just a nice little bunch of callbacks that we saw in this movie and noticed. So it was really cool to see them both sort of meld together at certain points.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, of course, Danny realizes, okay, this is serious. This evil is out there. It's much in the same way as the evil that he had to deal with at the hotel.
Right.
And he realizes that he has to help Amber because logically they're going to come after her, and he knows this. Mm-hmm. And so then that, of course, just sets in motion the rest of the film, essentially, is them working together to try and either avoid or evade the knot as much as they can. And eventually, of course, they have to take the knot on head first.
Right.
And before they do that, we get a really cool scene where, of course, I should backpedal a little bit. So Amber ends up using her shining ability to find Danny in New Hampshire, and they have a conversation, and he explains everything and kind of, when he first noticed how his shining affected him and how he's dealt with it, how she should try to deal with it, and that, hey, look, this knot group is not somebody that you need to be taking on. It's somebody that you need to avoid.
Definitely.
They're going to try and come for you. And so he tries to warn her. And so essentially Rose does try to pay her a visit. And this is why I think both talked about this before the show cap, that it seems like she at one point or time was a looker, or at least still is a looker, but obviously is now a member of the knot.
Right.
Because she's able to actually phase out in a meditative trance, much like Amber does herself, goes to New Hampshire, travels there, and thinks that she's going to get inside the mind of Abra, and mess with her and let her know that, hey, we're on our way and we're coming, so they can get details to figure out where she's at in the country. And little does Rose the Hat know that Abra is actually more than prepared for her visit.
Yeah, and that was one of my favorite scenes of the movie. Basically, Rose has like these out-of-body experiences, is what it more or less looks like, and she is like flying through the air, looking down on the earth, trying to spot this whoever she's looking for. And so she finds her, and she goes into the room, and she sees that Abra's laying down asleep, and so she starts. It's hard to explain. There's a whole wall full of filing cabinets, which is basically all of Abra's memories and thoughts, and it's basically a representation of her mind. And so Rose basically looks at her sleeping and says, "Oh, you're sleeping, I see." And then she turns and goes over and starts going through the filing cabinets, I guess, to get intel and find out more about this girl. And all of a sudden, you see one of the filing cabinets close on Rose's hand, and she's like trapped. And she turns around, and she's freaking out because she'd never had anybody be able to overpower her. And all of a sudden, you see Abra standing, looking at her, and it's a very creepy scene. I mean, it's awesome, but very creepy because it's Abra, but it's her face, and there's no eyes on her face. And so she's sitting there talking to her, telling her, I knew you were going to come, and I'm not going to let you do this. And so they basically have a mind war where they're fighting each other, and Abra's like holding her down, and she's trying to get away. And then Abra just knocks the crap out of her and basically knocks her conscience all the way back across the country to where her body is. And it's so powerful that it knocks her back into her body, and she goes flying across the yard of where they're parked, basically.
And at that point, the Knot realizes, Rose more or less realizes, hey, she is a force to be reckoned with. We need to find her now.
Right.
And we need to
either turn her,
or of course,
or feed
for a long time. And eventually, of course, they realize there's no point in turning because she's so powerful. She would just take over,
right?
And then who knows what might happen. She may become just this quasi ultimate, Knot member, and it'd be her and only her,
right?
So they don't want that. They want to keep what they've had for a long time going, and so eventually it picks up even more, and so they start to close in on Abra and her house, and Danny realizes, okay, he needs to help this kid out. He enlists the help of Billy, his friend.
Right.
They, of course, travel out to Iowa to show Billy, like, look, I'm not making this up. I need you to believe me. You believed in me all those years ago. You're the only friend I can talk to who will even remotely understand this situation. And so, of course, they go out, and Billy starts to realize, okay, this is crazy, but this is true, and this is wild.
Right.
We have to go back, because they end up finding the glove. That's, of course, what Amber requests of Danny, is like, if we're going to keep an eye on these Knot folks before they get here, in order for me to try and place them, I need to have access to that glove, because they touched it. So if they touched it, I can, trying to figure out where they are. So, of course, they...
Right. So, basically, the baseball kid that they capture and feed off of earlier in the film, one of the members takes his baseball glove and holds it in his hand, and so she sees that in her vision of what's going on, and she decides that if she can get that glove and touch it, then she can likely see where they are because they've touched it, and I guess that helps her to locate them. So back to what you were saying.
Right, of course. And so they're able to, of course, they have to go through a very tense, awkward, nauseating process of actually digging up the glove, get it, take it back to Abra. Of course, her dad initially sees Danny in the driveway, and of course is not quite under the impression of how he got there, and so of course, as any father would, says, "Get off my property, stay away from my daughter, quit saying her name."
Right.
And of course, then Abra has to show him, like, no, look, she shines a little bit and shows him, this is the person I've been talking to, this is what happened, this is why I screamed and had that episode this night, he's here to help. So, of course, her dad understandably needs a drink or two to calm his nerves, and they all talk about, okay, well, if these people are coming, what's our approach? Do we have a plan? Like, what's our game plan here? And so they come up with what they think is a good battle plan to take on the Knot, and for the most part, it almost works.
Right.
They go into a wilderness type setting. They're far away from the house, and of course Amber's projecting herself on this picnic table in the woods, and so the Knot think that they have her, realize they don't, and one by one Billy and Danny start to pick them off with rifles, and so you think at first, like, oh, okay, they flipped the script and everything's going to be okay here.
Right.
But there's still, of course, obviously a little chunk of movie left.
Right.
So, as it would turn out, they get most of the Knot members, but not all of them. As Crow Daddy is able to actually sneak into Amber's house, ends up taking out her father, and is able to kidnap her to take her back to Rose.
Right.
And of course, we get another sad scene. There's a lot of really gut-wrenching scenes in this one.
Yeah.
Just to be honest, folks. And so there's a silver lining, somewhat of a happy ending, believe it or not. That's a good one, believe it or not. So, of course, pun intended. So, Billy Freeman's character ends up saving Danny's life because he ends up getting pushed by Snakebite Andy. She says, go to sleep, because she's the last one left of the knots that's there that tried to take out Abra in the first place. Of course, they weren't going to send the entire house. Rose conveniently stays back wherever they were at before, so that at least one of them can still run the show in case things go south. And so, of course, Danny is able to be overpowered by Snakebite Andy. But, fortunately, Billy Freeman comes around the corner, is able to take her out. He walks up to make sure Danny's okay, but he's just close enough within range of Snakebite Andy. And, of course, Danny realizes this and says, don't approach her,
right.
Step back.
Stay away.
Because he knows what's about to happen. And, of course, unfortunately, in this next scene, Snakebite Andy says and looks at Billy Freeman and pushes him and says, kill yourself. And it's a pretty rough scene all the way around. But with that, she smokes away, or steams away, I should say, and they all do. And Danny realizes, all right, well, this is no time to, I don't have time to process this. It's unfortunate, but I've got to get back to Abra, get her safe. That is the mission. And so they press forward with that, and he realizes, I need to find where Abra is. And so she's heavily sedated by Crow Daddy to try and depress her shine ability, but she's still powerful enough to where she's got it faint enough that Danny can actually pick her up.
Right.
And we get a really cool scene when that happens, because Danny is able to communicate, touches her palm, and I don't want to use a Game of Thrones reference, but he kind of reminded me a little bit of a Warging in a way. And so he was able to talk through Abra to Crow Daddy. And he's talking trash the whole time, very confidently. And of course, Crow Daddy's like, well, I don't really see what you're going to be able to do where you're sitting, because we need her alive, and you can't get her. So pretty sure we're in control here. And then Danny drops a nice line where he's like, well, that's a fair point, but it seems to me like you really haven't thought everything all the way through, and why would you? You're immortal, semi-immortal. There's no reason for you to wear a seatbelt. And Crow Daddy says, okay, yeah, and so then at that point, we see Abra shift her hands, flip the car. I shouldn't say flip, actually just careens it off the road into a tree very hard. He flies right out, eventually wriggles and steams away himself. Rose is completely upset about this, because essentially we get the sense that she feels each one of them leaving. The crew, so to speak. And so it's just Rose at this point that's left, and she realizes, okay, you guys want to play hardball and join powers? Watch this. And so she starts to suck up as much steam as she can, and we, like you said earlier, notice it's regenerative powers, because the hand that was quite clearly broken and severed ends up mending itself back to a regular hand. And so from there, Danny realizes, okay, this isn't going to end unless we go back to the source. And of course, by the source, we mean the Overlook Hotel.
And I mean, he basically feels that because the hotel was strong enough to mess with him as a kid, that it would likely be strong enough to mess with Rose. And so he decides that they need to go back to the Overlook Hotel and have her meet them there, because he knows she's coming. He knows she's going to find them, and he wants to keep Abra safe. And so they go to the hotel, and he tells Abra to stay in the car because of how strong the hotel is. He doesn't want it to take over her, and he doesn't want her to have to be in there any longer than she needs to be. And so he tells her to wait out in the car, watch for Rose, and to let him know when Rose gets there. And she says, well, what are you going to do? And he says that he's got to go in and wake the hotel up, because it's been condemned since the events of the first movie. And so he goes inside, and there's a whole big scene where he goes through, and the hotel starts waking up, all the lights start turning on by themselves, and he basically goes on a path almost identical to his father, and ends up at the same bar that his father ended up at, talking to the bartender, that's not really there. And has a whole conversation with him and come to realize that the bartender is no longer the bartender from the first movie. The bartender is now his father. And so he realizes that, and he talks to him as he is his father. But his father is so connected and now part of this hotel that at first he tries to, say, you're mistaking me for somebody else. I don't know who you are. I don't know who you're talking about. And so he just continues to talk to him about their past and about everything that happened. And eventually he does kind of lead you to believe that he knows who he is and says some things that, would lead you to believe that.
And even before that, of course, Danny has this plan in place all along to end this once and for all. And so he goes down to the boiler room, cranks those up to 11, right. But not all the way, because he doesn't go full 12. He wants to make sure that he leaves it on for just long enough to get them that out to where he can go back down and finally cut it off and essentially blow up or burn down this Overlook Hotel. But before that happens, we get this wonderful standoff. So, right. Of course, Rose arrives. Amber comes in, hotel cranks up even more as far as wattage. The lights get brighter noticeably.
Right.
Because earlier in the movie, of course, Holleran's character, being a spirit guide to Danny as a child, explained that when he got to the hotel, he was like a 1,000,000-watt light bulb.
Right.
Or battery. And so you can imagine, of course, with Amber being tenfold powerful as Danny, I mean, she can power an entire city. The hotel is loving that at first. Although you made a good point about this, Charlie, before the episode, which, of course, I think they might have just at this point in the film realized, well, we don't want this to be a 3-hour movie. Right. So they didn't really amplify or show much in the way of how the hotel affected Abra, in right. the way that it affected Danny. But I think that was also a testament to show that she was so powerful that, yes, it could have affected her, but she was sort of almost above it. Mm-hmm. Or wasn't intimidated by it, given what she'd already been through in the film already.
Right.
It's like, okay, yeah, this hotel is creepy and haunted and horrifying, but I've made it through this. I have to overcome this. I have no choice but to not let it affect me. And so then, of course, a couple of different callbacks throughout as they go back to the same typewriter scene. Right there, the same typewriter that's been there since 1980. Rose gets sort of trapped there by them forcing her into one of their minds. And of course, at first, she thinks she's in the mind of Amber and says, oh, I like the upgrade you made.
Right.
Because before it was just her bedroom with some filing cabinets. Now it's the hedge maze with all these boxes. And so, of course, they run around much the way that Jack Torrance went after Danny in the maze. Mm-hmm. And so Rose eventually says, you thought you were clever, but at the end of the day, I still got you. But then it hits her. She realizes, wait a minute.
Right.
This isn't my mind after all. And of course they think they can be slick and box her up, but she's too powerful at this point. That's not going to work. She says enough, ends up breaking the box and breaking out of
the mind
of Danny Torrance. Mm-hmm. And back into the Overlook Hotel, walks up the stairway, much in the same way that Jack Torrance did towards Wendy.
Right.
So that's a nice little callback. And then, of course, Danny tells Amber to run. When I tell you, take off. So he tries to take her on. That doesn't work. She ends up throwing him right back down the staircase, which is the same fate that his dad felt. So again, just all kinds of callbacks at this point, left and right. And she takes the same axe, essentially, that Jack Torrance used, and punctures his femoral artery, so he starts to bleed out. She starts to prey on his pain and screams and starts to suck up his steam, but also starts to see all of the terrible past events coming up, and she's loving it because she thinks, yeah, show me all this terror and all this pain and all these screams. What's screaming in those boxes? And of course, Danny is kind of smart alecky. He's like, oh, they're not screaming, they're starving, because it's the plan or theory that Danny has is that, look, these are the two same types of evil. Mm-hmm. And the hotel's type of evil could potentially feed off of Rose the Hat, and that's exactly what happens. All of those premonitions come back out of the box,
right,
and essentially feast on her, much in the same way that she's been feasting on, these children and other members of the Knot.
Right, and that pretty much ends her.
And so she effectively is out of the picture, and then those same premonitions that have been unleashed do just that. They unleash themselves on Danny because they're, of course, in their home field advantage.
Right.
And they try to and successfully possess him much in the way that they did Jack Torrance. And so he comes after Amber with the axe in room 237, but she puts that to a stop, uses her powers, and says,
Right.
no, I know Danny's still in there. I'm speaking to Danny right now. You're just a manifestation of this hotel. You're a cancer. I want to talk to Danny.
Mm-hmm.
And brings Danny back just long enough for him to get down to the boiler room, snap it off, and of course ends up burning down the hotel. And
Right.
there's a hope that Danny makes it out, but obviously he does not. But of course the next scene that we see, of course Amber is able to make it out.
Right.
And back to her mother. And she's up in her room having a conversation with none other than the spirit of Danny Torrance.
Right.
And so he, much in the same way that Dick Halloran was his spirit guide, becomes, or it's at least implied, that he's become
her
Amber's spirit guide.
Right.
And so he says, listen, there could potentially still be evil out there, because Rose mentions, you think killing me is going to stop this? There's plenty of us out there. We're going to keep coming. We'll never stop. This never ends. And so he reiterates that, there might be others out there, but you shouldn't be afraid to shine. Shine on.
Right.
And so, of course, she goes and talks to her mom. She's like, is everything all right? You good? Just a little check-in. And she says, yep, I'm fine, just, talking to Dan, but nothing to worry about. I'm good here.
Right.
And so then she goes to the restroom, and you see that same creepy old lady that I believe is Miss Grady at the end of the day, essentially. And so, much in the same way that young Danny dealt with and wrapped it up, it's implied that once she shuts that bathroom door that, okay, the cycle starts again, and she's going to take care of it and figure out her own way to box up all of these demons and start to just take on the evils of the world using her shine powers. So then that ends Dr. Sleep, and of course we left out some parts like we do in most of our movie reviews. We don't want to go scene by scene.
Right.
We want you to actually go out and form your own opinion about the movie, see it, enjoy it, what have you. But overall, a solid film, and again, while it's not going to make a lot of noise at the box office, if you watched The Shining, then you'll certainly enjoy Dr. Sleep, because it wraps everything up with a nice bow. And so, Charlie, as we wind down here ourselves on Nerdy by Nature, we've got to give this a Nerdy by Nature ranking. So I'll start. I think for me, having watched it, I almost was tempted to give it a 4, but I feel like we reserve those for blockbuster films and iconic films, ones that are game changers. So to me, I think I need to weight that down a little bit, because it was watchable, but I mean, certainly it could have been shorter.
Right.
There could have been different ways to go about it. So I feel like a 3 to 3.5 is appropriate. I'm going to stick with a solid 3.
Okay.
For Dr. Sleep. How did you feel?
For me, if I was to compare it to the first one, to The Shining, then I would say it would be a 4, just because I really enjoyed it a lot more than The Shining. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with the time of the movie as well, just because The Shining was made in the 80s, so it feels like an 80s movie, and Dr. Sleep was made today, so it feels like a today's movie. So, in my opinion, I would put it at 4 compared to the old one. As a movie overall, then I would say probably around a 3, 3.5. Like you, just I don't think you could watch it and enjoy it thoroughly without seeing The Shining. So I feel like that might hinder it a little bit, but most people loved The Shining, so it may not have the same feel to other people as it does to me. But I feel like it was a very solid, good movie. I never felt bored. It didn't ever feel long to me. So, yeah.
All right, fair enough. And so with this episode coming to a close, wanted to let you know that, of course, we'll be taking the next week off. So, of course, Thanksgiving is right around the corner. So we here at Nerdy by Nature want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving with you and yours. And so our next episode after that, for our first episode in the month of December, will be on the graphic novel God Country that is done by Donnie Cates and Jeff Shaw. And it's a mystical thrill ride of a graphic novel. It's one that we certainly look forward to reviewing. And Charlie, I'm going to let you, since you're a little more familiar with the content, just briefly describe what it's about, so they have an idea of what they can expect for the next episode.
It's just it's a feel-good book, and it's very positive. I mean, it's got some sad parts to it, in that it's about a group of kids and their grandfather has Alzheimer's, and though he doesn't remember a lot of stuff and doesn't remember a lot of his family, and he finds a sword on his property, and basically whenever he picks up this sword, he becomes his younger self and knows who everybody is, completely healthy. And so the book is about him fighting to keep this sword and fighting to keep his sanity and his memories and keep his family, basically.
And so be on the lookout for that episode coming in December. And again, to all of you listening, you and yours have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday, Black Friday shopping. Go out and get some good comic book deals and Blu-ray, what have you. I'm sure we'll be doing the same. Might even start out the episode with, if we have any hauls, we'll talk about that for sure. And with that, be sure to like and subscribe. And by all means, share this with anybody that you think will enjoy the content, or if you want to introduce somebody into this realm, we absolutely implore you to do so. There is still time for you to be our first commenter. We would love to hear from you as to what you would like to see, in this case here.
Right.
And feel free to discuss things that we got wrong, things that we got right. We're all for constructive criticism here on Nerdy by Nature.
Absolutely.
And so with that, as always, signing off, I'm Agent Smith.
And I'm Captain Rogers. God bless.